Drake,
What?
where's the dungeon?
Goes right there. See, I drew it with a magic marker.
There is not exactly a lot of dungeon in Darkest Dungeon 2. The vast majority of the game takes place on the roadside you're traveling along on a stagecoach. Darkest Dungeon 1, for the most part, at least, actually took place inside of various dungeons, and traveling down a road doesn't exactly deliver the same atmosphere or oomph as a dimly lit dungeon that is steadily getting less and less lit by every passing second. You still have the torch, of course. It was an integral part of the first game, and that doesn't really change in the sequel. However, there are a lot, and I do mean a lot, of foundational changes in the sequel that make it a significantly different game. Different enough that it's upset a fair amount of the original audience in a way that I couldn't possibly blame them for. If you wanted a game that was a direct sequel with all of its core mechanics intact, then that is not what you will find. Personally, however, aside from the overall atmosphere of the game being weaker and despite many hours in the original, I can already say I much prefer the sequel from what I have played. In the first game, there was a lot of management. A ludicrous amount, even. You play through a territory or a dungeon with a party, and if you're lucky enough, your group will be healthy enough after that run that you can manage to do another one. If you're lucky. It's not unlikely you'll bring back some serious ailments or far too much sanity damage for it to be reasonably safe for you to bring the same group 2 or 3 times in a row. So instead, you make another party, and you take them into a dungeon, you come out, hopefully they're good enough to go again, and if you're really unlucky, you're setting 2 teams on the bench and putting another team together. Mechanically, I don't find this to be very fun. I've got characters I've been leveling, I want to use them, I want to advance further, but instead I'm being forced to level another group or eat it out in the dungeon with my half-dead, disease-ridden team from the prior run. The sequel doesn't work remotely like this, not at all. It's more of a true roguelite. You pick your characters, you travel down a path based on a confession you pick, the main difference of which is that the first confession doesn't force you to defeat a boss in its lair before you have access to the final boss at the end of the route, whereas the others do. And beyond the first confession, you'll also have access to entering the Sluice. The Sluice is basically the Warrens from the first game, except you don't have access to a map, so you're blind as you're traveling through it. You also don't have to travel through it at all, as it's considered a bonus region. You win, you die, it doesn't matter. You come back to the next run with fresh characters, mostly. Characters that survived prior runs can be given small bonuses called memories, assuming you've unlocked them with the candles, which are the end-all be-all currency for the meta progression in this game. In the prior, you had bust, portraits, deeds, crests, all of which upgraded different buildings, and you got at the varied locations on the map with different beasties you'd encounter at them. So, that's been simplified a fair amount too. First thing I did on a successful run was just pump enough candles into each character to unlock them, which probably isn't a terrible idea if you want to experiment with different team builds yourself. Also, the Paladin isn't in this game, and I haven't actually gotten the opportunity to use the Bounty Hunter yet, as despite unlocking him, he doesn't actually appear in the character selection screen. You have to spend 4 of your meta progression candles at an inn, which you'll encounter at the end of each region you travel down, and that's assuming that the inn has him available. When you select him, he replaces whichever character you'd like him to replace, but that's only until the next inn where he will leave and your other character will return. He also apparently can't be found at the inn prior to the final boss of a run, with the exception of the first run, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. Aside from using candles to unlock heroes, you can use them to upgrade heroes and unlock different progression paths for them, as well as unlock combat items, trinkets, stagecoach items, pets, costumes, and prior mentioned memories. There also isn't much in terms of prep work to be done in comparison to Darkest Dungeon 1, where you would have to purchase anything you might think you needed for the dungeon to come. Things like food, bandages, shovels, which would help you more easily remove blockage and debris. If you didn't bring everything you needed, then you were far more likely to get screwed, and that just added to the hopeless atmosphere that the game sought to place you in. I don't feel that same hopelessness in 2, and it doesn't help that with every failed run, it upgrades an item that you can purchase for free in the shop. The Radiant Flame. Equipping this only makes the game easier for you, and progressively more so as you continue to suck like I do. I'm not complaining that there's something making the game easier per se, but there's also not really any kind of downside to just slapping this on whatsoever, at least as far as I know. So I'm just gonna be a little baby and put it on every single time, because, like, the game's still hard. It's hard as hell. There is some downright brutal RNG that can end your run in the snap of a finger, and that much is the same. All in all, I like both of these games. The narrator is the same, and he absolutely kills it in both titles. The aesthetic, the eldritch abominations, big ol' spiders, and angry little piggies prepared to skewer me the moment I've stepped into their field of vision. The spear still covered in blood from the prior victim immediately causes me to contract syphilis. The sequel still aims to provide these hopeless scenarios, and even where it's less impactful than its predecessor in that regard, it makes up for it in other areas. You're not left to manage 3 or 4 teams constantly hot-swapping between who's healthy and who isn't, or who would have been the best for this kind of dungeon or that kind of dungeon. The overall management and prep work has been completely gutted, and it's a far more linear progression. Mind you, I get that there are people that like these management systems in place in the first game. They aren't for me, but if you do like them, then that makes the choice easy enough, right? If you like heavy management and prep work, being in an actual dungeon, and an all-around more hopeless atmosphere, then play the first game. If you like a more simple and straightforward roguelite experience, then play the sequel.